Hi everyone, Stepan here. It's Thursday, so welcome to another Thursday endgame video. Today we are going to go over a set of endgames which are vastly underestimated in study and often messed up in practice because people take them for granted, people see them as an easy draw, and well, there could be some issues. So we are looking at knight versus pawn endgames. Obviously, a bishop versus a pawn is an easy endgame to draw. You simply move the bishop away, control the queening square, eventually take the pawn or draw with the 50 move rule. Queen versus pawn, as we saw, can be tricky if the pawn is on the bishop file, if the pawn is... There are some exceptions. Rook versus pawn endgames can be tricky. And knight versus pawn endgames are easy to draw if you know a simple set of rules, and hopefully today I will be able to show you that. So I've spent maybe 2 or 3 hours trying to figure these out, which is not a lot compared to other endgames I try to figure out. And we are going to go over pawns on the 4 central files, so C, D, E, F, knight files and rook files, because they are different. And I'm also going to show you a checkmate pattern, which is interesting, how a knight can checkmate the king, which is kind of extraordinary and rarely happens, but it can still happen. Okay, so let's start with the easiest examples, and that's a 7th rank pawn, which seems very good for the side with the pawn, against a knight. Now, the first example we are looking at is a position in which the knight can get in front of the pawn. Now, one thing you have to remember, if your knight gets in front of the pawn, in this case on the e1 square, if the pawn was on the d file, then on the d1 square, if the knight can get in front of the pawn, it's a draw, and it's a very simple drawing mechanism. So what you do with white, you immediately go behind the pawn, knight e1. We are also going to look at slightly harder examples. So knight e1, let's say king to d2, knight to g2, and obviously this is the best move because if the pawn promotes, you take it. Again, you're not playing for the win here with white, you are playing for a draw. And now you simply control all the squares. The black king cannot get around to your knight, and if black promotes, then you take it, it's a draw. So let's say king to d3. Black tries to be slightly more resilient. Now in this case, you could immediately check and win the pawn. If the king doesn't go to d3, let's say the king goes here, well, then you can simply approach with your king and eventually win the pawn. So this is a very simple drawing mechanism. If you are fighting a single pawn with your knight and you can get in front of the pawn, then it's an easy draw. If the king starts attacking your knight like this, then you just go around to control both squares and most importantly the queening square. Now, if the knight cannot get in front of the pawn, the situation requires calculation, but most often it's still going to be an easy draw if you know what you're doing. So knight f3 is, well, okay, I'm going to show you what happens after knight f3, and for example king to f2. You now get a very messy position in which you need to play precisely. Black obviously queens, and you have lost the game. So you need to be careful. Not every single check wins or draws. Not every single check works. What you have to do is be precise and look at the position in a way that you want to set it up as the previous one we saw. You want your knight to get in front of the pawn. You want your knight to be able to control the queening square. Therefore, knight to g2 check. And now let's look at the options. If the king goes to f2, then you play knight to f4. Now this may seem tricky, but it's really not, because if the pawn promotes, you can simply check. This pattern you have to remember. Forking the king and the promoted queen is the way to draw most of these positions when the knight cannot get in front of the pawn easily. So in this case, if he tries king to e3, then you take the pawn, obviously. If e1 equals queen, then you check. If he does nothing, let's say if he moves away, well, then you get in front of the pawn easily. In this case, yeah, sorry, you take the pawn. If, for example, king to f1, then you can just do this and get in front of the pawn, and it's an easy enough endgame. If, let's say, king to g1, then knight to e1, and you are in front of the pawn. So for example, king to f2, knight to c2, and we have the previous position on the board. So when your knight is unable to get in front of the pawn, look for forking checks and look for ways to get behind the pawn. Again, still an easy draw. If your knight is not, I don't know, on h8, then it's obviously winning for black. But if your knight is able to check in a way that gets it into a position to fork the king and the promoted queen, then good. If the knight checks in a way that gets it in front of the pawn, then again an easy draw. So in this position, knight to f3 wouldn't be good. Knight to g2 is simple. If, for example, the king goes to f1, then we have knight to e3 check, okay, king to f2, and knight to c2. Again, controlling the two squares. If the king waits, hoping for your knight to do something crazy, then you just approach with your king and an easy draw. Now, positions when the knight isn't so favorably placed are harder. So here it's harder to visualize your knight getting in front of the pawn. It's harder to visualize your knight checking the king and forking. So try to be precise and try to spend your time wisely and calculate. So for this position, I'm going to give you two options and pause the video, calculate which one works better. One option is knight e4, the other one is knight to g4. Okay, and I'm actually going to turn on the engine to show you the solution. Okay, pause the video. Okay, so in this position, I hope you've calculated correctly. Knight to e4 is the move that draws, and I'm going to show you how. Okay, if you play knight g4 first, let's look at that. Why doesn't this work? After knight to g4, the king moves away, and you cannot check, you cannot get in front of the pawn. The pawn is basically promoting on the next move. If you try knight to h2, then black obviously isn't going to be stupid and promote and fall for a fork. He's going to move his king away and then win on the next turn. So for example, king to e3 should be good enough to draw. And if you go here, then I go here, and you can basically resign. There is no way to stop it. And if you go knight to e4, then the only move for the king is either d1 or f1. So let's say king to d1, and now knight c3, you win the pawn. If the king goes to f1, then knight g3, you win the pawn. It's a fairly simple mechanism if you know what to look for. Of course, there are no strict rules which are going to help you draw this every time, but if you know what to look for, it's going to be easier. Okay, now let's look at a more unfavorable position when the pawn is on a knight file, so b or the g files. Now, the reason why this is harder to draw is because you don't have the option to move to the other side of the pawn. The knight, of course, likes space, likes to be able to jump around the pawn, and since it cannot jump around past the h file, it restricts its options. Here, of course, if it's white to play a knight e2 check, draws easily. But if it's black to play g2, and now, well, what can you do? If you play knight to e2 check, then king to f1, and you have just lost this position. And after knight to g2, you have to play it smartly, but it's still very hard. So for example, knight to e6, you try to go around. Okay, king to h2, the king gets out. Knight to d4. Why am I doing this? Because if g1 equals queen, then knight to f3 check. So, for example, king to g1, knight e2 check. Okay, and now king to f1, and again an unfavorable position. Okay, so let's try to use the engine for this. I would recommend that you practice these with an engine because it's going to be easier to understand. Okay, so why is this such a bad endgame? I hope you can see the evaluation bar on the right side of the screen. No, okay, I'll actually try to filter that in. Just give me 1 second. Excuse me. I thought I had it covered. Okay, a bit more. Okay, like this. Okay, so now you can see the evaluation bar. Obviously black wins. Why does black win? Because after g2, your knight cannot get on the other side of the pawn. So if you try knight e6, you lose. If you try knight e2, then king f1, and whatever you do on the next move, the game is lost. If your king was 1 square closer, then you would play king to d2, d1, or d3 and draw. The reason why knight e6 doesn't work is, let's say king to h2, Knight to d4, you try to check, but the king just goes back to g1. And now if you repeat with knight to e6, then the king goes to f1, and whatever you do, it's still lost endgame. So remember that with knight pawns, it's very hard or impossible to draw if you cannot get in front of the pawn. So the same rule is applicable as with the central files. If you can get in front of the pawn, then it's a draw. If you cannot get in front of the pawn, then maybe it's a draw. Of course, positions are not exact. There is going to be no way to predict what exact position is going to help occur in the game. It helps if your king is closer. That's the reason why I put the king away. So let's look at what happens when the knight is in front. So the knight is in front of the pawn, therefore it should be an easy draw. So let's see. Knight to g2, pawn to g2. Okay, so what options does black have? Black can go to g3, but for now your knight is perfectly placed. So let's improve our king. So let's say king to c2. Okay, king to g3, knight to e2, king to f2, and now king to d2 would be an easy draw, obviously, because we are stopping that. But let's try to be a bit more resilient and not draw easily. So knight to f4. Obviously now if the pawn promotes, then knight to h3 check draws. So let's say king to f3 and now knight to h3. And what we are doing is we are getting in front of the pawn in time. Knight to g1, for example, king to h2, knight to f3 check, again blocking the king. If king to h1, we just go king to d2, and he is now forced to promote because it's stalemate. So if you are facing a pawn on a knight file, you want your knight in front of the pawn. If you cannot get your knight in front of the pawn, and if your king is too far away, then it's lost. The reason for that is it's very hard to do the geometrics with the knight when you don't have both sides of the board to play with. Now, the third type of position is a rook's pawn, and the rook's pawn is very hard to draw, almost impossible if your knight cannot get in front of the pawn. Again, if your knight can get in front of the pawn, then easy draw. There will be a huge difference between a pawn on the 7th rank, or the 2nd rank in this case, and the pawn anywhere else. The reason why I didn't cover any positions where the pawn is on the 5th rank is because they are easily drawn. You always have enough time to approach with your king and get into a favorable position. When the knight is too far away, this is losing, and there is no way to draw it. What you have to do again is use the geometrics to get your knight in front. Okay, so here again, there is a losing move, there is a drawing move. Only two moves make sense. Pause the video and try to decide which move loses, which move draws. Okay, so the losing move is knight c3 check. I'll try to explain it in words, but I may not be good at it. So the reason why knight c3 is bad is because you cannot use the key squares c1 and h2 that easily. Okay, so here in this position, king to b2, knight to a4, king to b1, knight to c3, king to b2. Let's okay, so for example, king to b3, knight to c5, and now we go king to c4. We just have to chase the knight away, and then it's an easy win. Okay, as soon as the knight is forced away, then the game is easily winning. So after knight c3 and king b2, you are unable to occupy these squares. Okay, it's very hard, impossible to occupy these squares. And you want to be able to occupy these because then A, you will be able to get in front of the pawn, or B, you will be able to check the king away without the pawn being able to move forward. So let's look at the correct move, knight to b4 check. Now, knight b4 check is much simpler because after king to b3, for example, you now go knight d3. And as you can see, you are controlling these two squares. Okay, b4 is also important, but c1 is probably the most important square in this position. And there is basically nothing black can do to advance. If the king waits, for example, with king to c2, then you again check it away. If the pawn advances, then you just play knight c1. And again, a very, very simple a very, very simple endgame to draw. Let's look at, for example, king to c3, which seems most resilient. Now you use the key square c1, and of course if the pawn pushes, then you take it. If, for example, king to b2, then knight d3. Again, you are preparing to control these three squares, and once you control these three squares, the pawn is not going anywhere. For example, king to c2, knight b4 check, key square. King to b2, knight d3 check. If he tries king to a1, then simply knight to b4, the pawn is not going anywhere. a2, you take it, the king moves away, you check it. And yeah, simple, very, very simple, very simple. If the king goes to b1, you just approach with your king. As soon as you can defend your knight with your king, that means that the knight can stay put, and you will eventually win the pawn, and it's going to be a draw. Okay, now let's look at a simpler example. When the knight is in front of the rook pawn, then easy draw. Same as with the knight files, same as with the 4 central files. Seems scary, but easy draw. Remember these techniques. At least, if nothing else, you are going to be more confident when playing and knowing that your knight is in front of the pawn. So he goes king b2, you go knight b4, you are controlling everything. He goes, for example, king to c3, you go knight a2 check. He goes, for example, king to b2, you go knight b4, and no progress. King c3, knight a2, king b3, knight c1, you are controlling everything. King b2, knight d3. Remember the previous position, it's the same thing. King a1, knight b4, and we are doing the same exact thing. So if the knight can get in front of the pawn, you will easily be able to control the key squares, and you will easily be able to draw. Again, my suggestion, take this endgame, put a pawn on the central files, just go through the files one by one, and do it with a pawn on the 6th rank, do it with a pawn on the 7th rank. After you drew an engine, just use the highest rated engine, after you drew an engine on all the files on the 6th and the 7th rank, you will basically be able to draw this anytime, if it's possible. Okay, now, yeah, 7th rank. Now this is a study by Grigoriev, and I think I saw it, or a similar position to this. I think I saw it in Dvoretsky's book, and in this position, okay, king to f2, probably the best move. And now knight to b3. You are trying to get behind the pawn, for example, king to e1, king to e6, let's say we move towards the pawn, king to d1, let's say king to d5, let's say king to c2, let's say king to c4, and again an easy draw. If your king is able to defend, for example, king to b2, king to b4, king to b1, easy draw. If your king is able to defend the knight, then good, you are in time. Had the black king been closer, then it's an easy win. Of course, if your knight cannot get in front of the pawn, if your knight cannot jump around to the other side of the board, if there was the minus a file then and minus b file, then it would work. But on the rook files with the pawn on the 7th rank, whether you can draw or not is going to depend on whether your king can help defend the knight on a key square. Key square being a square from which you control the queening square. Okay, now let's look at another example when the pawn has not advanced yet. So, for example, in this position, knight to b3, you are trying to get your knight into a favorable position. King to d3, knight c1 check. King to c2, knight a2, king b3, knight c1, and we have the same position we already looked at, which is a draw. The problem occurs when black plays a2. And now after king to e6, king to e2, what you have to do is again be able to calculate whether your king can come around to the defense of the pawn quickly enough, or if the game is a loss. Okay, so let's say instead of king to e2 we play king to, okay, yeah, king to d3 is easily refuted because of knight c1. So okay, king to e2, and I would invite you to calculate whether this is a draw or a loss. This could be a tough one. Okay, pause the video. Okay, I'm going to use the engine for this one as well, so that I don't make up my own moves. I knew that it was a draw, but I didn't know exactly how to draw it, or I didn't know the exact best... Oh, sorry, not king to e2. That again fails to a fork. Okay, I need to be a bit more resilient. Okay, let's say king to e4. Ah, sorry, I asked you to pause the video. Ah, sorry, I messed this one up. I wanted to choose a position which I didn't know so that we can look at it together. Sort of ruined the surprise. Okay, but let's look at it. Why is it a draw? Okay, the reason why this one is a draw, and this is again a study by Grigoriev, is because whenever the king approaches, you can get a check-in from c1, and you can easily draw. So, sorry, no point to the last position, but I'm going to try to explain what my thought process was for trying to set this up. If you can create a barrier with your knight, that's a term I learned from Jesus de la Villa's 100 endgames you must know. If you are able to create a barrier with your knight, then you can draw the game. In this case, of course, once the knight gets to b3, the barrier is created, and there is no easy way for the king to make progress. Okay, so of course, if the king goes to d3, then we know it was a simple drawing technique that we already looked at. Pawn on the 6th rank, blah blah blah. We know about the key squares, and it's going to be easy. If the pawn advances, however, this barrier is very important. Obviously, this square is taken, and the king cannot go here. This square is taken, the king cannot go here. These two are occupied by the knight already, and there's basically no way for the black king to make progress. If the king wanders too far away, let's say to f2, then your king has enough time to approach. So when the rook's pawn has advanced on the 7th rank, the only way to draw is a knight barrier. And I know it sounds tricky, and it's again going to depend on the proximity of the kings. If the black king was already on c2, then of course easy win. But sometimes it's going to be possible to set this up. Okay, so let's summarize. Okay, so with the pawn on central files, what you have to do is get your knight in front of the pawn. If the knight cannot get in front of the pawn, then you need to be able to control the queening square, for example, like this, and not allow the black king to approach. If the knight is too far away, you have to look for tricks. You have to look for ways to stop the king from moving out. In this case, as we said, knight to e4 was the drawing move, because wherever the black king moves, you're going to check it and win the pawn. So when the knight is unable to get in front of the pawn, look for forks, look for checks. On the b and the g files, on knight files, because your knight is unable to jump around both sides of the pawn, it's very hard to draw unless your knight can get in front of the pawn. So look for ways to either get your king closer quickly enough to be able to defend the knight while the knight is controlling the queening square, or look for ways to get your knight in front of the pawn. Okay, and on the 6th rank, on rook files, it's important to look for proper key squares from which you can check the king away indefinitely. In this case, as we said, knight to c3 loses because you are unable to control the pawn. Knight to b4 is a draw because the knight can control c1, d2, b4, and a2. When the pawn has advanced past the 6th rank on a rook file, it's almost impossible to draw unless you can A, create a knight barrier, thus controlling the king from entering the position, or B, get your king close enough to be able to defend the knight while the knight is controlling the queening square. I hope this makes sense. I hope you benefited at least a bit from this video. I know these endgames are often taken for granted. And because of the last example I'm going to show you, I hope you will take them seriously. Okay, the final example is an extreme example in which the side with the pawn has tried a bit too hard to win. This happens when your king is close enough, the side with the knights, the side with the knight king is close enough to create a mating net. In this position, black has tried a bit too hard to win. Had black not pushed his pawn to h3 on the previous move, the position would still be a draw. And in this position, white wins simply. This is a mating pattern you simply must know. Knight to f1, putting black in Zugzwang, and after pawn to h2, knight to g3 checkmate. So try to be smart. If you have a pawn on the rook file, even though that's the easiest file to win on, be smart. If the pawn was on h2 here, you would have to move your king away. So that wouldn't be the same pattern. But this is one of the extreme examples where the knight can checkmate, where the low knight with the king can checkmate. And if you're trying to win, don't try too hard to win, because you might get mated. Okay, so knight f1, putting black in zugzwang, and knight to g3 mates. Remember this pattern. Okay, hope you liked the video. Let me know what you think. See you tomorrow for the middle games, and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.